The Britain that Julius Caesar first glimpsed across the misty waters of the English Channel in 55 BC was nothing like the chaotic wilderness that Roman propaganda would later describe. From the fertile lowlands of Norfolk and Suffolk to the rolling hills of northern territories, the island was home to sophisticated Celtic societies, each with its own traditions, kings, and networks of influence. The Iceni, settled in the flatlands near the Wash and the estuary of the Thames, were a people of considerable wealth, their graves and settlements revealing hoards of gold and silver, sometimes weighing more than a kilogram, not merely as adornment, but as symbols of authority and connection to the divine. Their political system revolved around a monarchy with carefully managed succession, and evidence suggests women could inherit power, a practice that centuries later would echo in the reign of Boudica. Further north, the Brigantes controlled the largest territory in Britain, stretching across much of what would become Yorkshire, Lancashire, and into the Scottish borders. Their name, the Elevated Ones, reflected both the hilly lands they ruled and their status among neighboring tribes. Operating as a confederation of semi-autonomous sub-tribes, the Brigantes maintained massive hill forts like Stanwick, covering hundreds of hectares and showcasing sophisticated earthworks that had evolved over centuries. To the south, the Cativalani, under leaders such as Cassivellaunus and his predecessor Cavilones, expanded aggressively into neighboring territories, establishing dominance in the southeast. Their urban centers, like Verulamium, reflected continental influence, with planned streets, craft quarters, and advanced construction, evidence of trade and cultural exchange reaching as far as Gaul. Iron Age Britain was not a land of scattered farms, but a complex society with fortified settlements, thriving trade, and advanced agriculture. Hill forts varied in size from small promontories to massive complexes like Maiden Castle in Dorset, where thousands could be housed within multiple concentric defenses. Urban planning at sites like Danbury revealed zones for metalworking, pottery production, and grain storage, hinting at proto-urban life. Field systems, crop rotation, and selective livestock breeding demonstrated sophisticated management of land and resources. British craftsmen mastered ironworking, creating pattern-welded swords, shields, and decorative objects combining functionality and artistry, influenced by continental Latin styles, yet distinctly British. Equally remarkable was the Druidic system. Druids were not merely priests, but judges, teachers, and keepers of knowledge. They memorized vast oral traditions, managing laws, genealogies, and agricultural calendars. Their sacred groves and centers, such as Anglesey, attracted students from across the Celtic world, and their authority was reinforced by the controlled access to literacy and sacred knowledge. Trade networks connected Britain to markets from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, moving tin, grain, livestock, and luxury goods, fostering both wealth and diplomacy. Tribes maintained embassies and intermarried with continental families, creating webs of alliances and obligations that Caesar would later exploit. By the mid-1st century BC, Britain was politically dynamic. Leaders like Cassivellaunus rose through military skill rather than birthright, using mobile cavalry, guerrilla tactics, and knowledge of the terrain to challenge rivals. Warfare was sophisticated, with iron swords, decorated shields, and war chariots that Roman observers describe with awe, combining mobility and shock power in uniquely British ways. Society was hierarchical yet flexible, with warriors at the top, craftsmen and farmers below, and women holding positions of political and even martial power. Slavery existed, but often allowed captives a path to freedom. Unlike the rigid systems in the Mediterranean world, the religious and cultural landscape was equally complex. Beyond Druidic control, sacred groves, springs, and hilltop shrines dotted the land, with ritual deposits of weapons, jewelry, and coins signaling offerings to the divine. Human sacrifice, though sensationalized by Roman writers, was rare, highly ritualized, and connected to crises or major festivals. Material culture, from metalwork to textiles, pottery, and woodworking, revealed centuries of artistic refinement and cultural exchange. Settlement patterns varied, with nucleated villages in the southeast influenced by continental trade and dispersed farmsteads in the north and west gradually increasing in sophistication. That'd be why the time Caesar ships first near the coast. Britain was a mosaic of powerful tribes, complex politics, rich trade, and a proud martial tradition. It was a land confident in its own identity, divided internally yet profoundly capable, and utterly unaware of the systematic conquest that Roman ambition would soon bring. Claudius, newly crowned emperor in 43 AD, knew that his authority in Rome was fragile. The Senate questioned him, the military doubted him, and whispers of Caligula's chaotic reign still lingered. To silence critics and establish himself as a force to be reckoned with, he chose Britain, a land that had intrigued Rome since Caesar's expeditions decades earlier. Britain was no unknown wilderness. The intelligence gathered from Caesar's campaigns, combined with continuous trade and diplomacy, revealed a land rich in resources, politically divided, yet capable of formidable resistance. Claudius' objective was not only conquest, but also demonstration. A statement that he could wield power where even seasoned generals had paused. The invasion force, carefully assembled and meticulously organized, numbered tens of thousands. Experienced commanders like Aulus Plautius led the legions, while Claudius himself accompanied the army, not as a tactician, but as the symbolic figurehead, ensuring that Roman eyes and minds would link the emperor's name to victory. Ships crossed the channel, designed to carry legions, cavalry, and equipment over unpredictable tides and sudden storms. The landing points were chosen for both tactical advantage and proximity to key tribal centers, relying on intelligence gathered through decades of Roman-British contact. As the Romans approached, the tribes were not idle. Local leaders had learned from Caesar's invasions and prepared defensive positions, rallying warriors and marshaling chariots along the coastal approaches. Yet the fractured alliances among tribes, some still resentful of rivalries dating back to Cavalloni's campaigns, meant that unified resistance was difficult. The Romans exploited this, negotiating with certain tribes, securing hostages, and winning allies even as they advanced. Claudius' arrival injected not just soldiers but political authority into the campaign, signaling that Rome now approached as an empire in full, not merely a military expedition. The first battles were fierce. Roman discipline met British agility. Legions advanced in tight formations while chariots darted along the flanks, spears flying, horses thundering. Yet the Romans adapted quickly. Siege engines, artillery, and carefully engineered fortifications allowed the Romans to secure beachheads and push inland, creating a rhythm of advance that combined overwhelming organization with tactical flexibility. Towns and tribal centers that had once seemed impregnable gradually fell, not solely due to military might, but through a combination of diplomacy, intimidation, and the methodical application of Roman engineering. Each conquest reinforced Claudius' authority both among the legions and back in Rome, where news of his presence on British soil spread quickly, bolstering his image as a decisive and capable ruler. The local population, witnessing both the efficiency and relentlessness of the Roman advance, faced difficult choices. Some tribes attempted to resist, leveraging knowledge of the terrain and mobility of chariot-based warfare. Others submitted, offering hostages, tribute, or alliances in exchange for protection against rival clans or to secure their own survival. The pattern mirrored Caesar's earlier expeditions. Rome relied as much on shrewd political maneuvering as on the sharp edge of the sword. By carefully balancing force and diplomacy, Claudius established footholds that would grow into permanent centers of Roman administration, laying the groundwork for the integration of Britain into the empire over the decades to come. After establishing a secure foothold along the southern coast, Claudius' legions turned inland. The countryside of southeastern Britain presented a patchwork of rolling hills, dense forests, and river valleys, each feature offering both opportunity and challenge for the advancing Romans. Unlike the open plains of Gaul, here terrain dictated strategy. Wooded hills could conceal ambushes, rivers became natural defensive lines, and marshes slowed the movement of heavy Roman formations. Yet for all these natural obstacles, Roman discipline and organization proved decisive. Every legion marched in tight cohesion. Scouts advanced ahead to map the terrain, and engineers constructed temporary bridges, roads, and fortified camps that allowed the army to maintain momentum even in the most challenging regions. The first major confrontation occurred against tribes unwilling to submit, chief among them the powerful Cativalani under King Caratacus. This tribe, descendants of Cavalloni's warriors, had long dominated central southern Britain. They controlled fertile lands along the Thames and had fortified settlements that were difficult to assault directly. Caratacus, a leader whose reputation for cunning and valor had grown since his father's campaigns, understood that frontal attacks against Roman legions would be costly. Instead, he employed guerrilla tactics, rapid strikes against Roman foragers, ambushes along narrow roads, and strategic retreats into forests where heavy Roman formations were less effective. Yet the Romans were methodical. Every river crossing was an exercise in engineering precision. Temporary bridges, supported by pontoons and reinforced with earthworks, allowed legionaries and cavalry to cross under hostile observation, while artillery and missile troops suppressed enemy positions. The psychological effect on British warriors, accustomed to mobility and quick strikes, was profound. Here were men who could move swiftly, but could not overcome the relentless, organized pressure of Roman strategy. Roman camps, carefully fortified each night with ditches, ramparts, and watchtowers, became symbols of permanence and inevitability, signaling to tribes that Rome was not merely a passing raiding force. It intended to stay. Siege warfare became another defining feature of Claudius' campaign. Tribal strongholds, often perched on hills with deep ditches and wooden palisades, resisted initial assaults. One notable example was a fortress in the heart of Cativalani territory, where Caratacus had concentrated his warriors and supplies. Roman engineers surveyed the site, identifying weak points and planning methodical approaches. Siege engines, torsion-powered catapults, ballistae, and battering rams were positioned to bombard gates and walls. Romans dug approach trenches protected by mantlets, allowing infantry to advance under relative cover. The process was painstakingly slow, but precise, demonstrating the Romans' mastery of patience, engineering, and combined arms tactics. Over weeks, the fortress defenses were systematically dismantled, its warriors forced to surrender or flee, and its population brought under Roman control. These sieges were more than military operations. They were demonstrations of technological and organizational superiority, serving as warnings to other tribes about the futility of resistance. Diplomacy ran parallel to these campaigns. Claudius' envoys traveled ahead of the legions to meet tribal leaders, offering terms of surrender, promises of protection, and the recognition of client kingships. Submission often required hostages, usually the children of tribal nobility, and annual tribute in grain, metals, or military service. These measures were not purely coercive. They also established a framework of trust, or at least dependency, between Rome and local rulers. Leaders like Mandubricus, previously influential only regionally, became key intermediaries, mediating between Roman ambitions and tribal interests. This dual approach of military might and political negotiation allowed Claudius to consolidate control far more efficiently than brute force alone ever could. One of the most dramatic episodes of the inland campaign involved the crossing of the Thames, a strategic artery flowing through the heart of British territory. The river had long been a natural defensive barrier, heavily patrolled by Caratacus forces. Roman engineers constructed temporary causeways under cover of night, while diversionary attacks drew enemy attention away from the main crossing point. The moment the legions set foot on the northern bank, disciplined formations advanced immediately, forcing British defenders to retreat before they could organize. The psychological impact of seeing thousands of Roman soldiers appear seemingly from nowhere was profound, eroding confidence in tribal resistance and encouraging further submissions. Even as military operations continued, Claudius remained a visible symbol of Roman authority. Though he did not lead every battlefield maneuver, his presence at key points, overlooking sieges, reviewing legions, and participating in ceremonial entries into captured settlements, reinforced the legitimacy of the Roman campaign. News of his appearance traveled swiftly among tribes, boosting the perception of Roman power while reminding any potential dissenters of the emperor's personal involvement. Amid these campaigns, local societies experienced profound upheaval. Fields were appropriated for Roman use. Hill forts were either destroyed or incorporated into Roman defenses, and traditional tribal hierarchies were reshaped. Yet this integration was not simply destructive. Roman administration introduced regular taxation systems, urban planning in newly established settlements, and trade networks that linked Britain to continental Europe in ways previously unimaginable. Markets began to circulate goods, crafts flourished under new demand, and British elites increasingly participated in Roman-style political and military practices that by the end of these early inland operations, the map of southern and central Britain had begun to transform. Tribes once independent now acknowledged Roman authority, either through direct submission or client kingships. Resistance persisted, particularly in the northern regions and among tribes familiar with guerrilla warfare. But Claudius' campaign had established a foundation of control, demonstrating the combination of military discipline, engineering skill, and diplomatic acumen that made Roman conquest so enduring. After consolidating control over southern and central Britain, Claudius' legions faced the true test. The northern territories, where the land itself seemed to resist Roman domination. Rolling hills gave way to dense forests, marshy lowlands, and rugged uplands that limited the movement of heavy infantry and cavalry. The tribes here, chief among them the Brigantes and Ordovices, were fiercely independent, and intimately familiar with every valley, stream, and hill. Caratacus, having retreated northward after his defeats, became the central figure of resistance, rallying warriors from multiple tribes under a banner of unity against the Roman invaders. Unlike the southern tribes, northern warriors avoided open confrontation. Ambushes in narrow passes, sudden night attacks on Roman outposts, and harassment of supply lines became the norm. One particularly harrowing encounter occurred in a dense forest near a river crossing, where Roman scouts were lured into a trap. Hidden archers fired volleys from the treetops, while warriors armed with long spears and slings attacked from concealed positions. The Romans, trained for open field combat, suffered confusion and casualties. But even in this treacherous terrain, discipline and training proved decisive. Legions formed defensive squares, shields interlocked, and engineers quickly constructed makeshift barricades to secure retreat paths. Eventually, the Romans forced the tribes to disengage, showcasing the adaptability that made their campaigns successful despite unfamiliar territory. Caratacus' leadership became legendary during this period. He demonstrated not only courage but strategic brilliance, moving quickly between tribal territories to consolidate forces, sharing intelligence, and maintaining high morale despite setbacks. He understood the psychological component of warfare as much as the physical, inspiring his warriors with speeches invoking ancestral valor, the sacredness of their lands, and the threat of enslavement under Roman rule. For months, the Romans found themselves chasing an elusive enemy, forced to adapt siege techniques and combat formations to match guerrilla-style warfare that Claudius' commanders, including experienced generals like Aulus Plautius, recognized the need for a multifaceted approach. Cavalry units were expanded to pursue fast-moving raiding parties. Scouts were trained to navigate forests and uplands, and local guides, sometimes coerced from defeated tribes, helped map terrain and anticipate ambushes. Roman logistics evolved. Supply depots were fortified and strategically placed to allow rapid reinforcement, and temporary fortifications were constructed along likely routes of enemy attack. This methodical approach gradually wore down the northern tribes' ability to resist. A pivotal moment came during the campaign against the Ordovices, a northern tribe entrenched on high hills with natural defensive advantages. Roman legions approached cautiously, using artillery to bombard hilltop positions, while engineers constructed siege ramps that allowed infantry to ascend gradually under protective cover. The battle was fierce. Boulders were rolled down against attackers. Flaming arrows rained from above, and close-quarter combat erupted at the crest. After days of relentless pressure, Roman discipline and technological superiority prevailed. Surviving warriors were captured or forced to flee, signaling to other northern tribes that resistance, while heroic could not match Roman persistence. Yet even as the Romans secured victories, Claudius' strategy balanced terror with diplomacy. Surviving leaders were often spared if they submitted and pledged loyalty. Hostages were taken to ensure compliance, and local elites were incorporated into the Roman administrative system. This dual approach, military might coupled with strategic political accommodation, gradually transformed the northern regions from fragmented, independent tribal societies into semi-integrated components of the Roman Empire. The campaign culminated in the legendary final stand of Caratacus. Cornered in Wales with a small contingent of loyal warriors, he made a desperate attempt to defend his homeland. The Romans, using scouts and careful reconnaissance, surrounded the last stronghold, negotiating where possible but prepared for a decisive assault. Caratacus' final surrender was both dramatic and symbolic. He appeared before Claudius not as a broken man, but as a dignified leader, maintaining his honor and inspiring admiration even among his conquerors. Rome, recognizing his valor, allowed him and his family to live in exile in Rome, a rare gesture that both celebrated the martial ethos and served as propaganda for Roman mercy and clemency. By the conclusion of these northern campaigns, Britain was transformed. While pockets of resistance remained in remote areas, the legions had established a network of forts, roads, and administrative centers. Tribal elites were co-opted into Roman governance, trade networks expanded, and Roman culture, language, architecture, military practices began to influence daily life. The conquest of Britain, from Claudius' landing on the southern coast to the subjugation of the northern tribes, demonstrated the combination of military engineering, disciplined strategy, adaptive tactics, and political acumen that became hallmarks of Roman imperial expansion. This final phase of Claudius' campaigns not only secured territory, but also established a framework for centuries of Roman influence in Britain, leaving behind a legacy of roads, forts, and settlements that would endure. Long after the legions departed, Caratacus' story, meanwhile, became a symbol of resistance, honor, and the enduring struggle between freedom and empire, a story told for generations on both sides of the Roman world. Even after Caratacus' dramatic surrender, the story of Roman Britain was far from over. While the legions had defeated major tribal coalitions, the conquered lands were not a quiet, obedient province. Small bands of warriors still lurked in the forests of Wales, the hills of the Pennines, and the misty highlands of northern Britain. These were not the organized armies of the south. They were agile, intimate with their terrain, striking swiftly at isolated Roman patrols, ambushing supply lines, and vanishing before reinforcements could arrive. For Rome, this was a different kind of war, one not decided by open battle, but by endurance, intelligence, and relentless presence. Tio managed this. The Romans established a network of forts and roads that would become the veins and arteries of their control. Each fort was a bastion of military might, garrisoned with cohorts trained to patrol surrounding territories and maintain order. Roads connected these outposts to each other and to the southern administrative centers, enabling the rapid movement of troops, messengers, and supplies. The construction itself was a massive undertaking. Engineers surveyed treacherous terrain, marshes were drained, rivers bridged, and cuttings were carved through rocky hills. These roads were more than infrastructure. They were instruments of control, symbols of Rome's enduring presence, and tools for reshaping local economies. Villages along these routes soon found themselves intertwined with Roman trade and culture, whether they liked it or not. Yet, life along these frontiers was tense. Roman soldiers patrolled long, lonely stretches, constantly alert to ambushes. Local tribes learned to disguise themselves as peasants, fishermen, or merchants, only to strike unexpectedly. One winter, a patrol near the frontier in northern Wales found its path blocked by a frozen river. The soldiers assumed safety, but a hidden band of Ordovician warriors launched a ferocious attack from the surrounding woods, forcing the Romans into a defensive square amid snow and ice. Survival depended not only on discipline, but on innovation. Makeshift bridges, signal fires, and coordinated counterattacks were devised on the spot. Stories of such encounters spread along the frontier, instilling caution among the legions and a grudging respect for local resilience. Meanwhile, Roman administrators were learning the delicate art of co-opting local elites. Tribal leaders who had survived the campaigns were offered positions as minor magistrates or advisors, their loyalty ensured through privileges, land, or hostages. Some families embraced Roman citizenship and the cultural trappings that came with it, baths, villas, Latin literacy, while others plotted quietly, biding time for opportunity. This dual strategy of integration and intimidation prevented large-scale uprisings for years, but never fully eradicated the spirit of resistance. Cultural exchange began to subtly reshape Britain. Roman artisans introduced new building techniques, pottery styles, and clothing fashions. Local craftspeople adopted Roman methods while maintaining their own traditions, creating hybrid styles that reflected the meeting of two worlds. Markets in towns like Camulodunum, modern Colchester, bustled with goods from Gaul, Spain, and Italy, while local farmers supplied grain, livestock, and timber. Even religion began to blend. Roman gods were worshipped alongside local deities, sometimes in the same temples, sometimes in small shrines along roads and rivers. At the same time, Rome's military presence reshaped social structures. Young men from tribal families were recruited into auxiliary units, serving alongside Roman soldiers in distant lands, gaining training, discipline, and exposure to the wider empire. When they returned home, they carried not only skills and weapons, but ideas, stories, and a taste of the Roman world. Some used this knowledge to gain status within their tribes, others to subtly resist, organizing new tactics or forming alliances under the radar of Roman oversight. One fascinating episode occurred in the forests near the River Severn, where a coalition of smaller tribes, long thought subdued, coordinated a series of raids that targeted Roman supply convoys. The Romans, stretched thin and forced to rely on local informants, initially suffered setbacks. But through patient strategy, rotating garrisons, and the clever use of fortified supply depots, the legions gradually contained the threat. These engagements were smaller than the battles against Caratacus, but no less significant. They were proof that conquest was not a single moment, but a continual process of negotiation, adaptation, and vigilance. Even daily life along the Roman frontier had a rhythm of tension and adaptation. Soldiers maintained strict discipline. Farmers adjusted to Roman taxation and market demands, and tribes navigated the complex web of loyalty, resistance, and survival. Trade, diplomacy, and intermarriage slowly blurred the lines between conqueror and conquered. Yet the memory of rebellion lingered, carried in stories, songs, and the whispered warnings of elders. Every hill, forest, and river held the shadow of past battles, the traces of fallen warriors, and the ever-present reminder that while Rome had won, it had also been forced to respect the power and cunning of the land and its people as the years passed after Caratacus' surrender. The landscape of Britain began to transform under the Roman eye, but the change was never simple or uniform. Where once rolling hills, forests, and villages defined the land, new settlements began to sprout along roads and rivers, centers of administration, trade, and culture. Camulodunum, the former tribal capital, became a bustling Roman colonia, its streets laid out in the familiar rectangular grids of Roman engineering. Soldiers patrolled the streets. Merchants hawked goods from Gaul and Hispania, and local Britons gradually adapted to new ways of life, or resisted them quietly in the alleys and forests outside the city walls. In Londinium, a small trading post on the banks of the Thames, Life was vibrant but precarious. The city grew rapidly because of its strategic position, a nexus for commerce connecting the Roman-controlled south with the untamed north. Markets overflowed with imported olive oil, wine amphorae, and fine pottery, while local farmers and craftspeople brought grain, wool, and leather. Merchants from across the empire mingled with local Britons, some eager to embrace Roman ways, others skeptical or resentful. The clash of languages, customs, and currencies created both opportunity and tension. A listener could imagine the aroma of roasting meat, the clang of smiths at their anvils, the chatter of traders haggling in Latin, Brythonic, and Gaulish, all under the watchful gaze of Roman soldiers. Yet beneath the veneer of prosperity, discontent simmered. The memory of past uprisings remained alive in whispers. The Ordovices and Silures in Wales, who had resisted Roman occupation fiercely, became legends of courage among local tribes. Fathers told their sons of ambushes that felled Roman patrols. Women recalled the bravery of husbands and brothers in the hills. Every festival, market day, and river crossing carried the subtle tension of potential revolt. Roman administrators, aware of this, continued to blend fear with incentive, offering land grants, Roman citizenship, and privileges to cooperative leaders, while demonstrating swift, brutal force against insurgents. Military strategy also evolved. Forts along the frontier expanded into fortified towns, with permanent walls, watchtowers, and complex gate systems. Soldiers no longer merely patrolled. They became anchors of Roman life, mediators in local disputes, and teachers of new skills. Auxiliary troops, recruited from both within and beyond Britain, were stationed far from home, learning the Roman way of war, yet often forming bonds with local communities. A young Briton serving in a cohort might learn to read Latin, handle siege equipment, or ride as a cavalryman, returning years later to a homeland transformed and teeming with Roman influence, but still humming with the pulse of native culture. Religion offered another window into this cultural melding. Temples to Roman gods like Jupiter, Mars, and Minerva rose alongside older sacred groves and shrines. In some places, the lines blurred. Local deities were syncretized with Roman ones, their images sculpted in stone and worshipped alongside statues of emperors. Rituals incorporated Roman sacrifices and feasts, yet retained distinctly Celtic melodies, dances, or symbols. This fusion was not merely ceremonial. It was a survival strategy, a way for Britons to navigate the overwhelming presence of Rome without losing their identity entirely. Trade, too, created new layers of connection. Goods, ideas, and even stories traveled along roads and rivers. Amphorae marked with the stamps of Gaulish potters appeared in northern forts. Luxury silks from the east occasionally reached Londinium's elite, and simple clay tokens might circulate in local markets as early forms of credit. Craftspeople experimented with Roman techniques, blending them with native patterns, decorated pottery, jewelry combining Celtic knots with Roman motifs, and textiles woven with both local and imported dyes. These exchanges, subtle as they were, slowly reshaped the material culture of Britain, embedding Roman influence while preserving echoes of the old ways. Still, tension never fully faded. In forests, hills, and remote settlements, bands of Britons continued to resist, staging raids, sabotaging roads, or quietly undermining Roman authority. Each garrison, each new road, each administrative edict was a reminder that Roman rule was present, but not absolute. The frontier was alive with stories of bravery, cunning, betrayal, and adaptation. Every soldier, merchant, farmer, or tribal leader became part of a larger narrative, a tale of conquest and survival, of cultural collision and coexistence, of a land slowly transforming under the pressure of one of history's greatest empires. By the late 50s CE, the uneasy balance between Rome and the native tribes was about to shatter. In the lands of the Iceni, in what is now Norfolk, a queen named Boudica emerged, not merely as a ruler, but as a symbol of resistance. Her husband, King Prasutagus, had tried to secure peace with Rome through diplomacy. He had even named the emperor as co-heir alongside his daughters, hoping to protect his family and people. But when he died, Roman officials ignored his will. They seized Iceni lands, flogged nobles, and humiliated Boudica herself. It was an outrage that inflamed the tribes, igniting a fire that had been smoldering beneath the surface of Roman occupation for decades. Boudica, standing tall in the council hall of her ancestral stronghold, addressed her people with both fury and purpose. Her voice was said to echo with a mixture of grief and resolve, calling upon the old warriors and young men, women, and even slaves who longed for freedom. Her words were not just about vengeance. They were about reclaiming identity, honor, and land. "We have tolerated Roman arrogance too long," she proclaimed. "The chains they place upon us will be broken by our hands." The revolt began with a series of calculated strikes. The Iceni first targeted Roman settlements on their borders, burning forts, pillaging granaries, and striking swiftly to avoid prolonged confrontations with organized legions. Soon, Camulodunum, the former tribal capital, now turned Roman Colonia, became the epicenter of their fury. Roman settlers, complacent in their sense of invulnerability, were unprepared for the ferocity of the attack. Flames consumed temples, homes, and administrative buildings, smoke rising in thick clouds above the city. Survivors fled in panic, leaving behind wealth, food, and the illusion of Roman permanence. Boudica's forces, numbering tens of thousands when allied with neighboring tribes, moved like a storm across the countryside. Londinium and Verulamium, both burgeoning Roman towns, were next. Archaeological layers of destruction later confirmed the stories. Streets flattened, buildings burned, and civilians caught in the chaos. Roman soldiers tried to mount a defense, but the rebels' knowledge of the terrain, combined with their sheer numbers and unrelenting rage, allowed them to overwhelm the garrisons. For a moment, it seemed as if Rome itself might falter in Britain. Yet the revolt was not just military, it was deeply symbolic. The destruction of Roman towns was a statement against oppression and cultural erasure. Tribal warriors carried banners emblazoned with ancient Celtic symbols. Women accompanied the fighters, some taking up arms, others tending to the wounded and carrying messages. Boudica herself was reportedly at the forefront, riding a chariot, her presence both terrifying and inspiring. Every clash was a mixture of strategy, passion, and raw emotion, echoing the centuries of tension that had built under Roman rule. But Rome, with its disciplined legions, eventually regrouped. Governor Suetonius Paulinus marched from the west with experienced troops, drawing the rebels into a decisive confrontation. Boudica's army, large but lightly equipped compared to Roman formations, faced legions trained in the art of organized warfare. The battle that followed was brutal. Ancient accounts describe the rebels encircling themselves, fighting with desperate courage. Yet the Roman formations, testudo shields locked, cavalry flanking, proved devastating. Tens of thousands of rebels fell. Boudica herself disappeared from history. Some say she took her own life rather than be captured. The revolt left an indelible mark on Roman Britain. Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium had to be rebuilt, roads repaired, and settlements reinforced. But the memory of Boudica became legend. Stories told in whispers and songs of a queen who dared to stand against one of the greatest empires the world had known. For the native Britons, she embodied courage, resilience, and the fierce desire for autonomy. For the Romans, she became a reminder that control over conquered lands was never absolute. Loyalty had to be carefully managed, not assumed. And so, after the flames cooled and the soldiers marched back to their forts, the land of Britain remained a tapestry of coexistence, resistance, and adaptation. The rebellion had shaken the empire, but it also reinforced the cycle. Roman roads, towns, and governance would spread. Yet local culture, memory, and identity would persist, sometimes quietly, sometimes in bursts of extraordinary defiance like that of Boudica. After the fury of Boudica's revolt had faded into smoke and ashes, Britain entered a new era of reconstruction and uneasy coexistence. The Roman authorities, though shaken, wasted no time asserting control. Governor Suetonius Paulinus and his legions rebuilt fortifications, reinforced roads, and re-established settlements. But this was not merely a matter of bricks and mortar. Rome needed to restore order, loyalty, and a sense of permanence. Camulodunum, the epicenter of the revolt, became a cautionary tale. Roman architects and engineers rebuilt it with straighter streets, stone houses replacing timber, and fortified walls designed to prevent another uprising. Londinium, which had been almost completely destroyed, slowly rose from ashes. Merchants returned, setting up stalls along cobbled streets. Craftsmen repaired or replaced pottery, tools, and jewelry. Taverns and bathhouses reopened, where traders, soldiers, and locals gathered, exchanging news and gossip while the aroma of bread and roasting meats filled the air. Life in the countryside was more complex. Many Britons had witnessed the wrath of Boudica firsthand. Some villages had been wiped out, while others maintained their homes but paid heavy taxes and tributes to Rome. A Roman villa here, a native longhouse there. The landscape was now a patchwork of cultures and power structures. Local chieftains who survived the revolt had to navigate the delicate balance of Roman law and traditional tribal authority. They collected taxes, enforced edicts, but also subtly preserved native rituals, ceremonies, and oral traditions in secret or within family circles. Trade flourished despite, or perhaps because of, the rebuilding. Roman roads connected ports and towns, facilitating the movement of goods. Imported wine from Gaul, pottery from Gaul and Italy, salt, metals, and locally grown cereals. London's docks teemed with activity as ships brought grain from the continent to feed both soldiers and civilians. Markets buzzed with traders calling out wares in Latin, Brythonic, and occasionally Greek. The empire's lingua franca making its mark even at the edges of Britain. Roman culture permeated daily life. Wealthier Britons adopted Roman fashions. Tunics dyed with vibrant colors, jewelry set with glass and semi-precious stones. Public baths became a hub of social life, where people discussed politics, philosophy, and local news over steaming waters. Yet, beneath this veneer, many Britons still honored their ancestral deities, leaving offerings at sacred groves or rivers, blending Roman gods with old Celtic spirits. The coexistence was subtle, like threads of two fabrics woven together, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes tensely. Even the military left a lasting imprint. Forts dotted the landscape, manned by soldiers who trained rigorously, drilled the locals, and sometimes married into local families. Roman discipline and engineering influenced everything from bridges to aqueducts, introducing new farming techniques and irrigation that increased crop yields. Yet the memory of Boudica lingered. Children heard tales of the fiery queen from parents and grandparents, a reminder that power could rise from beneath even the most disciplined rule. This period was not only about survival. It was about adaptation and fusion. Latin phrases crept into native languages. Roman architectural styles inspired local builders. New crops, such as grapes and olives, slowly took root. Britain became a living laboratory of cultural synthesis, a land where Roman imperial ambition met the stubborn resilience of native identity. In towns and villages, life carried on rhythmically. Dawn brought the call of workers to the fields, blacksmiths hammering in the smoke-filled forges, merchants arranging wares, and scholars copying texts in small libraries or private villas. By night, torches lit the streets as taverns filled with laughter, music, and the occasional heated argument. Echoes of a society that had endured turmoil but was slowly finding stability again. Yet the tension between two worlds, Roman order and native spirit, remained the pulse of Britain. Every wall erected, every road paved, every law enforced was both a testament to Roman ambition and a challenge to the stubborn cultural memory of the Britons. It was a delicate dance, conquerors imposing order, locals preserving identity, and generations witnessing the blend, sometimes imperceptibly, sometimes violently. Life for ordinary Britons after the revolt was a delicate balance between survival, adaptation, and subtle resistance. Dawn often found farmers in the fields, tending wheat, barley, and vegetables introduced by Roman techniques. Plowing had changed. Oxen yoked to iron-tipped plows cut deeper furrows, while rudimentary irrigation channels helped retain water in dry months. Some fields still carried remnants of older Celtic boundaries. Stone markers and sacred groves tucked away in corners, quiet witnesses to a culture that refused to vanish. In villages, longhouses and Roman-style stone cottages often sat side by side. Smoke curled from chimneys as women baked bread in clay ovens, their hands kneading dough while singing fragments of old songs. Children played in the streets, weaving between Roman carts and livestock, learning both Latin and their native tongue. Storytelling remained central. Elders recounted legends of heroes like Boudica, but also tales of gods and spirits, ensuring that memory and identity persisted even under Roman rule. Craftsmen thrived in this new environment. Blacksmiths forged plows, nails, and tools, sometimes imitating Roman designs, sometimes adapting them to local needs. Potters created amphorae and pottery for everyday use, combining Roman shapes with native patterns, swirls, knots, and animals that told ancient stories. Textile workers dyed fabrics in vibrant colors, using imported techniques, yet infusing patterns inspired by local fauna and mythology. Every item became a tangible blend of two worlds, carrying subtle hints of resistance and identity. Markets were bustling microcosms of post-revolt life. Traders from Gaul, Spain, and even distant Egypt brought exotic goods: wine, olive oil, fine glassware, and spices. Local farmers sold surplus grain, cheese, and wool. Latin phrases dominated trade, yet Brythonic words threaded through conversations, a quiet assertion of cultural resilience. Taverns offered more than food. They were spaces for exchange of news, secret whispers of dissent, and debates about justice, governance, and the memory of the revolt. Religion was equally complex. Roman temples rose alongside ancient groves and river shrines. Some Britons publicly worshipped Roman deities: Mars, Jupiter, Venus, often to appease authorities. Privately, however, offerings were left for Cernunnos, Brigid, or river spirits, bridging old traditions and new pressures. Rituals became covert acts of identity, performed quietly yet profoundly, threading a sense of continuity through the upheaval. Even leisure reflected this cultural fusion. Wealthier Britons attended Roman-style baths, enjoying hot rooms, massages, and pools while listening to Greek and Latin poetry. Music and dance blended styles. Celtic flutes and Roman lyres often played in harmony, creating melodies that carried both nostalgia and novelty. Festivals celebrated harvests, saints, and local heroes, sometimes overlapping with Roman calendrical events, a mix of fear, respect, and joyful defiance. But not all was calm. Tensions simmered beneath the surface. Roman taxes pressed heavily on villages, and legions maintained fortresses at strategic points, reminding locals of the ever-present authority. Secret plots, small-scale uprisings, and whispers of revenge occasionally flared, mostly suppressed quickly, but they reminded both Romans and Britons that memory of Boudica still burned fiercely. Every act of Roman rule had to negotiate this undercurrent of unrest. In the countryside, isolation sometimes bred resilience. Families relied on herbal medicine, local charms, and communal labor, preserving knowledge that had survived centuries. Women often became the custodians of this knowledge. Plant lore, midwifery, and protective rituals, quietly resisting cultural erasure even as they navigated a changing world. By nightfall, towns and villages settled into rhythm. Torches glimmered along streets. Guards patrolled fortifications, while families huddled around fires, sharing meals and stories. The smell of wood smoke, bread, and cooking meat filled the air. The landscape, scarred by revolt and rebuilt by empire, seemed alive. a land where every stone, tree, and river told a story of conflict, adaptation, and survival in this delicate tapestry. Rome was both a conqueror and a teacher, introducing roads, laws, and trade networks, while the Britons retained an unseen power, the ability to preserve memory, culture, and identity against overwhelming odds. Life was neither fully Roman nor fully Celtic. It was something new, fragile, and profound, a living dialogue between two worlds. The morning sun peeked through the small windows of a modest stone cottage in the bustling town of Verulamium, one of the major Roman settlements in Britain. Smoke curled from the hearth as Ira, a mother in her mid-30s, stirred the porridge, its aroma mingling with the scent of wet earth from overnight rain. Her hands moved deftly, a rhythm learned from years of feeding her family and managing a home that was both a shelter and a subtle statement of resilience. Her husband, Caius, a blacksmith trained in both Celtic and Roman techniques, left the cottage at dawn, carrying a satchel of tools and a small bundle of iron ingots. The clang of his hammer against metal would echo through the town by mid-morning, shaping horseshoes, nails, and plow blades. He often incorporated Celtic motifs, a spiraling knot here, a leaf pattern there, into otherwise Roman designs, a quiet assertion of identity in every strike. Their children, Taran and Brigid, ran barefoot across the cobblestones to join other neighborhood kids. Taran, curious and quick-witted, was already trying to mimic the Latin phrases he overheard at the market, while Brigid was more interested in the flowers lining the town's central square, plucking petals and weaving them into small garlands for the hearth. The children's laughter carried over the clatter of carts and the shouts of merchants, a small note of innocence in a world shaped by conquest and adaptation. In the market, traders from Gaul, Spain, and even North Africa displayed goods, amphorae of olive oil, colorful textiles, and fragrant spices. Ira's friend, Livia, ran a stall selling herbs, both for cooking and for healing rituals inherited from Celtic traditions. While she greeted customers in Latin, her eyes and gestures carried unspoken meanings, indications of who could be trusted, who respected the old ways, and who might exploit her knowledge. Religion, too, threaded quietly through daily life. That morning, Iris secretly placed an offering of milk and honey near the small grove behind their home, a tribute to Brigid, goddess of hearth and fertility. The Romans had their temples, but in hidden corners, Britons maintained their sacred spaces. Even as the town celebrated Roman festivals with pageantry and music, these small, private acts kept memory and belief alive, a delicate but unbroken thread through centuries of upheaval. Afternoons were a mixture of labor and learning. Taran would often help his father at the forge, watching sparks fly as molten metal met water, fascinated by the way fire could transform raw or into tools and weapons. Brigid spent afternoons with other girls, learning weaving and embroidery from her mother, patterns combining Celtic spirals and Roman geometric shapes. Every stitch and hammer strike was both a skill and a statement. They were part of the present, yet inheritors of a culture that refused to be erased. Evenings brought the family together around the hearth. Stories flowed of ancestors, of heroes like Boudica, of faraway cities like Rome, Alexandria, and Londinium. Some stories were warnings, others celebrations. All were lessons, shaping minds in a world where history was a living conversation between past and present. The children learned early that survival required adaptability, but identity required memory. Beyond the cottage, the town pulsed with life. Legionaries patrolled stone roads, merchants called out their wares, and craftsmen shaped the material culture that would define this era. Yet, beneath the Roman order, subtle acts of resistance persisted. Whispered tales, secret offerings, carefully hidden symbols on metalwork, pottery, and textiles. A silent dialogue between conqueror and conquered. As night fell, torches lit streets, and a gentle wind carried the mixed scents of bread, smoke, and damp earth. From a distance, the outline of the Roman fort loomed, a reminder of power and authority. But within the cottage, a family thrived, blending old and new, forging a life that was neither fully Roman nor entirely Celtic. It was a life defined by adaptation, resilience, and the quiet defiance of memory. Weeks passed in Verulamium. Life followed its rhythms. The clang of Caius' hammer, Ira's careful tending of hearth and children, the market's chorus of haggling and laughter. Yet beneath the surface, tension simmered. The Roman occupation had brought roads, aqueducts, and markets, but also taxes, levies, and a constant presence of soldiers whose eyes missed nothing. One evening, as the family sat around the hearth, a messenger arrived from the nearby countryside. His tunic was torn, his face streaked with dirt and fear. He brought news that would ripple through the town like a sudden storm. The Iceni are rising. Queen Boudica leads them. He gasped, barely catching his breath. They've attacked Camulodunum, and the Romans did not expect it. The children stared wide-eyed. Turon whispered, "Camulodunum, that's just beyond the hills." Brigid clutched her mother's sleeve. Ira's heart sank. She had heard the stories, the tales of Roman brutality and local leaders humiliated. But to hear them unfold now, so close, made the fear real that Caius' hands clenched instinctively. He had hammered iron for trade, not war. Yet the spark of rebellion resonated with him. Among the Britons, resentment had long been growing. Taxes, land seizures, and the humiliation of local leaders had created a tinderbox, and Boudica, the Iceni queen, had struck the match. By morning, the town was abuzz with whispers and preparations. Some citizens fled toward the hills, hoping to avoid the coming storm. Others gathered weapons. Farming tools turned into spears, iron from the forge repurposed into blades. Ira, knowing the danger, insisted her family stay close, hiding in the small grove behind their home. The same grove where she had placed offerings to Brigid weeks before. As smoke rose from distant Camulodunum, news arrived of Roman reprisals. Towns razed, temples desecrated. The rebellion was not merely a skirmish. It was a full-scale uprising that threatened Roman control in Britain. Soldiers marched toward Verulamium, and yet the Britons' courage inspired some townspeople to resist, to reclaim their dignity, however briefly. Caius and Turon moved quietly, sharpening tools and preparing defenses, while Brigid and Ira gathered food and water. But even as they prepared, they understood that the battle was not only physical. It was cultural, spiritual, and moral. Every shield, every makeshift spear symbolized centuries of tension between the Roman occupiers and the Britons who refused to vanish into history. When the rebels arrived near Verulamium, the town held its breath. Boudica herself was said to ride at the head of the Iceni warriors, her presence both terrifying and inspiring. People whispered of her fury, her loss, and her relentless determination. To the Romans, she was a dangerous insurgent. To the Britons, she was a symbol of vengeance and hope. The clash was swift, violent, and chaotic. Torches flickered across the night sky as screams and the clash of metal echoed through the streets. Caius fought not just for survival, but for the memory of his ancestors, for the children who must live on no matter who won this day. Ira, huddled with the children, recited prayers to Brigid under her breath, hoping the goddess would watch over them amidst the carnage by dawn. The smoke cleared, and the aftermath was grim. Verulamium had survived, but scars ran deep. Homes destroyed, the market in ruins, lives shattered. Yet, amid the despair, something persisted. The people's memory, their identity, and the stories of resilience. Boudica's rebellion, though eventually crushed by the Romans, became legend, a tale that would travel through generations, much like the stories Ira and Caius had shared with their children. And so, the story of a small family in Verulamium was forever entwined with the sweeping tide of history, a reminder that even in ordinary lives, the currents of war, rebellion, and courage flow, shaping destinies far beyond the hearth and forge that in the weeks after the attack, Verulamium smoldered, not just from fire, but from fear and uncertainty. The town streets bore the scars of rebellion, blackened rooftops, splintered carts, and walls etched with soot. Survivors wandered like ghosts, their eyes wide with stories that no one yet dared fully speak. Caius and Ira worked tirelessly to rebuild what they could. Caius hammered and reinforced, while Ira tended to the wounded and comforted terrified children. Turan, now older by necessity, if not by years, ran errands through the ruin market, dodging soldiers and displaced families. Each day brought more news. Roman legions were arriving, led by Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, moving with ruthless efficiency to crush the rebels. Villages that had celebrated Boudica's courage now cowered at the sight of approaching standards, the silver eagles glinting in the sun like harbingers of death. And yet, even in despair, whispers of resistance persisted. Small bands of Iceni and other tribes fled into the forests and hills, striking Roman outposts in surprise raids, then disappearing into the mist. These guerrilla tactics frustrated the Romans, whose rigid formations and discipline were powerful in open battle but vulnerable to the cunning of the land and its people. One evening, as Ira and Brigid collected water from the river, they overheard a group of villagers speaking in hushed tones. "The Brigantes in the north are planning something," one man said. "If the Romans overreach, they'll rise to—" Brigid's eyes widened. She tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mother, do you think they'll come here?" Ira hesitated. "Perhaps, but we must be ready, not just with arms, but with courage. Remember, courage is what survives even when walls and roofs do not." Meanwhile, Caius received a clandestine visitor, a former traitor familiar with the Roman legion's routes. "Paulinus marches south," he warned, "but he leaves his flanks weak. If the tribes coordinate, they could strike before the legions consolidate." Caius listened, heart pounding. He was a blacksmith, not a general, but he understood strategy from years of observing trade and barter. "We must protect the town," he said, "but we must also survive, and survival means knowing when to fight and when to hide." The story of Boudica's revolt, though ultimately a Roman victory, ignited something profound across Britain. In Verulamium, and in countless villages like it, the people learned to read the land, the enemy, and one another. Children, once shielded from fear, now whispered of secret paths, hidden stores of food, and signals that could warn of approaching soldiers. Families became not just units of kin, but cells of resilience. As the months passed, news of the North's unrest reached Verulamium. Other tribes, the Brigantes, the Trinovants, the Cornovii, began subtle acts of defiance, sabotaging Roman supply lines, sending coded messages between villages, and quietly training warriors. The small family in Verulamium, once ordinary, now stood at the edge of a vast network of resistance. Caius, Ira, and their children were no longer merely survivors. They were witnesses to, and participants in, a tide of history that would ripple across the land. One night, as Ira tucked Brigid and Turan into bed, she whispered stories of the Iceni queen and the bravery of those who dared oppose an empire. "History," she said softly, "is not only about the rulers and legions. It is about people like us, who face impossible odds, yet endure and pass on the courage to those who come after." Little did they know, the next chapter of rebellion was already stirring. A massive confrontation that would challenge Rome itself, and sweep this small family into events that would define the very fate of Britain. Spring came slowly to the rolling hills and dense forests of Britannia. The air smelled of damp earth and blossoming heather, but even nature could not mask the tension that gripped the land. Rumors traveled faster than the Roman legions. Rumors of coordinated uprisings from the north, whispers of secret alliances between tribes, and tales of brave, Iceni warriors who had survived the brutal reprisals. Caius paced the workshop as Ira finished tending the forge's final embers. "The Romans are tightening their grip," he said, voice low. "Paulinus has already retaken Camulodunum and Londinium. But there are reports of the Brigantes attacking supply convoys in the north. The resistance isn't dead. Not yet." Ira nodded, her hands shaking slightly as she rolled cloth over their meager stock of food. "We cannot fight them openly, But we can teach the children to be clever, to survive. And if the tribes can unite, perhaps there is hope. Beyond their village, a coalition began to form. Tribes that had once regarded each other with suspicion. Iceni, Trinovants, Cornovii, and even scattered remnants of the Catavilani started sending envoys and messages through forests and hidden riverways. Leaders met in secret glades, swearing oaths under moonlight to resist, strike where they could, and shield the innocent from Roman wrath. One night, a messenger arrived at Verulamium, panting, mud-streaked, with a folded strip of parchment. Caius took it cautiously. The writing was in a familiar hand. The code simple but clear: strike at the convoys, disrupt their paths, gather at the old hill fort in 3 days. The North moves south. Caius looked at Ira. They want us to help. Ira's eyes widened. We are not soldiers. We are blacksmiths, farmers, a family. Perhaps, Caius said slowly, but history is built by those who are willing to act. The legions will not wait for us. They move like machines, but machines have flaws. Brigid and Turan listened from the doorway, too young to understand all the danger, yet old enough to feel the weight of the world pressing in. We can't hide forever, Turan whispered. If the tribes strike together, maybe we can finally see them fight back. The next morning, the family and a few trusted villagers prepared. Weapons were sharpened, supplies hidden, and secret paths marked in the woods. The sky was a muted gray, clouds heavy with rain, mirroring the uncertainty of what lay ahead. When the first skirmishes began, it was chaos and precision entwined. Ambushes along narrow passes, sudden attacks on Roman convoys, and the deft use of the land, forests, marshes, hills, turned every minor advantage into survival. Caius discovered that the simple knowledge of terrain could rival Roman discipline, and Ira found herself guiding groups of women and children through hidden routes to safety, their courage quiet but no less vital. By the third day, the families of Verulamium, once on the edge of history, were part of a wider tapestry of resistance. They watched from hilltops as smoke rose in the distance from ambushed Roman wagons, and they knew every small act of defiance was a spark. Yet, the Romans were not easily broken. Suetonius Paulinus, a commander both brilliant and ruthless, adapted to the guerrilla tactics. Legions advanced with fortified camps, scouting parties, and brutal reprisals meant to crush morale. Every small victory of the tribes was met with retaliation, reminding the people of the cost of defiance. Amidst this, the children learned the stories of heroes not from kings or generals, but from the very people around them. Farmers who struck with cunning, women who carried messages through forests, and warriors who stood against impossible odds. Brigid, holding a carved wooden sword, whispered to Turan, "One day, we'll tell this story too, and others will remember us." By the end of the week, the scattered tribes had inflicted significant damage on Roman logistics. Though no full-scale rebellion had yet been achieved, the threads of unity were tightening. What began as isolated acts of resistance was now shaping into a coordinated challenge that could rival even the might of Rome. One that would eventually culminate in a confrontation so dramatic that Britannia itself would never be the same. And so, in the quiet villages and hidden glades, the seeds of the next great struggle were sown, connecting the courage of Boudica's revolt to the broader tapestry of Britain's fight for survival, identity, and freedom. Dawn broke over the misty hills of Britannia, a pale light spilling across the trembling forests and dew-laden grass. From the hidden hill fort, leaders of the northern and eastern tribes gathered, their banners muted against the gray sky, faces hardened but eyes alive with determination. Caius, Ira, and their small band had joined the coalition, carrying food, weapons, and the knowledge of every secret path through the woods. Boudica, the Iceni queen, stood at the center of the council, her presence magnetic and terrifying all at once. Her voice rang clear. The Romans are disciplined, but they are not invincible. We know the land, we know each other. Today we fight, not just for revenge, but for our children, for our future. The plan was daring. They would strike a Roman legion camp near the river crossing, where supply wagons were abundant but defenses thinner than in the cities. Scouts had reported gaps in the Roman formations, and the tribes would exploit every weakness by mid-morning. The sun had burned away the mist, revealing a patchwork of rolling hills, forests, and the silver glint of the river. Roman sentries spotted the distant movement and sounded the alarm, drums echoing through the valley. The legionaries scrambled, armor clanking, shields raised, but the first wave of tribesmen vanished into the trees like ghosts. From their hidden vantage points, Caius and Ira watched the attack unfold. Arrows rained down on supply wagons. Women and men darted through the forest with precision, cutting off escape routes, and the sound of battle cries, metal striking metal, filled the air. The Romans responded with discipline, forming lines, pushing forward with shields locked, but the tribes used every hill, hollow, and thicket to harass and isolate them. Bridget, clutching her wooden sword, stayed close to Ira, whispering, "They are so many, but they fight for us. They fight for everything we've ever lost," Ira whispered back, "and for everything we will gain." Hours passed in a blur of strategy and chaos. The tribes inflicted serious damage. Wagons destroyed, soldiers scattered, but the Romans were relentless. Paulinus, commanding with a cold, calculating efficiency, brought in reinforcements, forcing the tribes to adapt quickly. Caius realized that this was not just a battle of strength, but of wits, patience, and unity. By late afternoon, exhaustion was visible on both sides. Fires burned in the distance, and smoke mingled with the dust of battle. Boudica rallied her warriors for a final push, her voice a roar that carried across the valley. "For our homes, for our people!" The tribes surged, and for a moment, it seemed as if the legion might break. But Roman discipline held. Paulinus countered with a flanking maneuver, and the tribes were forced to retreat under heavy pressure. Yet, even in retreat, they left a mark: destruction of supplies, disruption of plans, and, most importantly, proof that Rome could be challenged as night fell. The coalition gathered in secret groves, nursing wounds, mourning the fallen, but also sharing stories of bravery and clever tactics. Caius sat beside Ira, exhausted but proud. "We didn't win," he admitted softly, "but we've shown that united, we are dangerous. Rome can't ignore us anymore." Boudica approached, her expression a mixture of grief and fierce resolve. "This is only the beginning. One day, we will strike a blow so great that they will remember it for generations. And each act of courage, each sacrifice, will bring us closer to that day." In the quiet hours before dawn, as the children slept and the fires burned low, the people of Britannia understood something profound. Survival alone was not enough. To live free, to write their own history, they would have to continue the struggle, turn whispers of rebellion into the roar of resistance, and carry the fight from hidden forests into open battlefields. The stage was set for an epic saga that would echo through time, a story of courage, strategy, and defiance against the greatest empire the world had known. Weeks passed since the river ambush, and the valleys and forests of Britannia had become a land alive with tension. Rumors of Roman retaliation spread like wildfire. Soldiers moved in disciplined columns, scouting parties crisscrossed the hills, and fortified camps were erected along every strategic route. Yet, the tribes were no longer scattered whispers. They had learned, adapted, and grown bold. Caius walked among the warriors, inspecting their weapons and listening to their concerns. Every face told a story of loss, determination, and hope. Ira approached him, carrying a bundle of arrows tipped with hardened flint, each carefully sharpened in secret workshops hidden deep in the woods. "They're bringing legions," she said softly. "We can't just ambush supply wagons anymore. This time, it will be a battle for survival." Caius nodded. "Then we must fight like we've never fought before. Not as scattered tribes, but as one force. Every hill, every river crossing, every forest path must be our ally." The coalition gathered at a central clearing, a natural amphitheater surrounded by steep ridges. Tribal leaders huddled over maps drawn in charcoal, marking Roman encampments, supply routes, and terrain features. Boudica's eyes, fierce and unyielding, scanned each plan, calculating every risk. "We have the advantage of the land," she reminded them. "They can march on roads, but we know the rivers, the forests, the hills. Today, we make them bleed where they least expect it." At dawn, the air was heavy with fog, and the smell of damp earth mingled with the scent of sharpened wood and iron. Scouts reported the approach of a Roman legion, their armor glinting even through the mist. Paulinus, the Roman commander, was cautious but relentless, fully aware of the humiliation his forces had suffered in the previous ambush. Boudica raised her arms, and the warriors fell silent. "Remember," she said, voice carrying across the ridges, "we are not fighting for glory alone. We fight for our homes, our families, and for the land that has nurtured us for generations. Every strike, every maneuver, every sacrifice brings us closer to freedom." The tribes moved into position, splitting into multiple units hidden among ridges, thickets, and riverbanks. Archers took high ground, their arrows ready to rain down. Spearmen formed mobile phalanxes capable of holding any advance. Cavalry units, though small, were nimble and fearless, ready to strike deep into Roman flanks. As the Romans marched into the valley, the fog lifted, revealing the scale of the trap. Arrows whistled through the air, striking shields and helmets. The warriors surged from the ridges, shouting war cries that shook the earth. Roman formations wavered under the unexpected onslaught. Caius fought alongside Ira, their movements synchronized, a mix of precision and instinct honed over months of guerrilla attacks. Brigid, though young, showed courage beyond her years, nimbly dodging spears and guiding small groups to safety. Every skirmish, every clash of iron, was punctuated by the roar of warriors and the cries of the fallen. Paulinus, realizing the severity of the trap, ordered his legions to form defensive squares and call for reinforcements. But the terrain betrayed them. Narrow river crossings became kill zones, forests choked their numbers, and every hill hid an ambush. The tribe struck again and again, slipping away before the Romans could fully respond. Hours turned into a brutal, exhausting day. Fires lit the valley, smoke curling into the sky. The air was thick with dust, sweat, and the metallic scent of blood. Yet, despite the carnage, the tribes held their ground, forcing the Romans into a grueling, unpredictable fight. As night fell, the battlefield was unrecognizable. Splintered wagons, scorched earth, and the echoes of a war that would be remembered for generations. The tribes regrouped, counting their dead, tending the wounded, and sharing stories of extraordinary bravery. Every survivor understood that victory was not measured by territory, but by the resilience they had shown, the unity they had forged, and the statement they had made to the mightiest empire on earth. Britannia would not bow quietly. Boudica approached Caius and Ira, her gaze somber yet fierce. "Today, we have done more than survive. We have reminded Rome that we exist, that we are dangerous, and that our spirits are unbreakable. But the battle is far from over. The next time they come, it will be worse, and we must be ready, not just to fight, but to win decisively." Caius and Ira exchanged a glance, understanding that their journey was only beginning. The war had escalated, the stakes had risen, and the legends of Britannia's defiance were only beginning to be written. In the shadows of the burning valley, the coalition whispered a silent vow. They would not rest until their land and their people were free. And history, they hoped, would remember their courage. The following dawn broke over a land scarred by yesterday's battle, painting the valley in harsh amber light. Smoke still curled from the smoldering wreckage, and the air was thick with the scent of blood, sweat, and ash. The tribes moved silently among the hills, their eyes scanning the horizon. Every warrior knew the next encounter would be larger, fiercer, and more brutal than anything they had faced before. Boudica stood atop a ridge, surveying the Roman encampments across the plain. Caius knelt beside her, studying hastily drawn maps of the enemy positions. They've called reinforcements from the neighboring provinces, he said, his voice tight. 3 more legions, fully armored, with cavalry and siege engines. They plan to crush us before nightfall. Ira adjusted her bow, her hands steady despite the tension. Then we give them no chance to organize. We know the land. Every ridge, river, and forest can be our ally. But this will be a fight unlike any other. The tribe split into 3 divisions, each with distinct roles. Archers took elevated positions along the ridges, their flint-tipped arrows sharpened to pierce Roman armor. Spearmen and shield-bearers formed mobile phalanxes, ready to intercept the main advances. Cavalry units, small but agile, were poised to strike deep into Roman flanks and supply lines. Boudica's plan was audacious. They would not merely fight. They would trap the Romans in a labyrinth of their own, making by midday the Romans advanced. The ground shook under the weight of disciplined legions, their banners snapping in the wind. Paulinus, resolute and proud, had learned from past mistakes. His formations were tight, his engineers erecting makeshift fortifications as they moved. But the terrain betrayed them. Narrow river crossings funneled their troops into kill zones. Forests masked hidden attacks, and the hills gave the tribes every advantage. The first clash was sudden and chaotic. Arrows rained from the ridges, striking shields and helmets with deadly precision. Cavalry swooped down from concealed paths, cutting through supply wagons and scattering the rearguard. Spearmen formed tight lines to meet the Roman advances, holding ground despite the enemy's superior numbers. Caius fought at the heart of the battlefield, his blade a blur of motion. Beside him, Ira moved like a shadow, her arrows finding gaps in Roman armor. Brigid, young but fearless, guided small groups of warriors around the flanks, sabotaging siege engines and cutting off supply lines. Every strike was calculated, every retreat deliberate, yet the cost was heavy. The valley echoed with the screams of the wounded, the clash of iron, and the cries of both triumph and despair. Hours passed, and the battle escalated. Roman cavalry attempted a flanking maneuver, but the tribes anticipated it. Hidden warriors struck from the undergrowth, lances and spears slicing into the enemy before they could regroup. Fires set earlier engulfed strategic points, creating chaos among the legionnaires. Paulinus roared orders, attempting to restore discipline, but the fog of war and the cunning of the tribes made every command uncertain. By late afternoon, exhaustion and adrenaline intertwined. Warriors on both sides were bloodied and battered. Yet, even as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, neither side relented. Boudica moved among her leaders, rallying troops, sharing encouragement, and striking down anyone who wavered. Hold! Fight! For our homes! For our families! Her voice carried like a thunderclap, a beacon of unyielding defiance. The final push came as twilight descended. The Romans, desperate to break the trap, pressed forward with everything they had. Cavalry charged, spearmen lunged, and archers unleashed a relentless hail of arrows. But the coalition's ambushes and guerrilla tactics turned the plain into a deadly maze. Roman formations broke under pressure, soldiers trapped between fires and hidden warriors. Chaos became the empire's enemy, and Britannia's warriors exploited it with lethal precision. Night fell. The valley was a scene of ruin and heroism. Fires burned across the plain, casting flickering shadows on the exhausted faces of the tribes. The Romans had been forced to retreat, battered and humiliated, leaving behind equipment, wagons, and a lingering sense of awe for the resilience of Britannia's people. Boudica, Caius, and Ira stood atop the central ridge, looking down at the battlefield. Silence stretched over the valley, broken only by the distant moans of the wounded and the crackle of dying fires. Today, Boudica said, voice steady but filled with raw emotion, "We have struck fear into the heart of an empire. But this is only the beginning. Rome will return, and the struggle will continue. Yet no one can ever say that we did not fight or that we did not rise. Caius and Ira nodded, understanding that their victory was both glorious and fragile. The war was far from over, but for now, Britannia had shown the world that courage, cunning, and unity could challenge even the mightiest empire. And in the hearts of every warrior, the fire of freedom burned brighter than ever. As Britannia's warriors celebrated their hard-won victory, whispers traveled across the empire. Rome, wounded in pride more than in body, could not tolerate such humiliation. Back in Londinium, the governors and senators convened, their faces pale under flickering torchlight. Word of Boudica's triumph spread quickly. The destruction of Roman supply lines, the decimation of legions, and the rise of a leader who inspired not just rebellion, but unity among the tribes. Governor Suetonius Paulinus, though shaken, was resolute. He sent urgent messengers across the empire, calling for reinforcements from Gaul, Germania, and even Hispania. Armies were to be mobilized, legions strengthened, and fleets prepared for transport. Rome's political elite debated the strategy. Some advised diplomacy, others demanded total annihilation. But one truth remained: Boudica's rebellion could not be ignored. Meanwhile, in Britannia, the valley still smoldered from the last battle. Boudica walked among her people, inspecting wounds, consoling families, and listening to reports from her lieutenants. Every decision carried weight: where to defend, where to strike, and how to maintain unity among tribes with centuries of rivalry. Ira and Caius returned from scouting, breathless and wary. "They're sending more legions," Ira said, "twice as many, with cavalry reinforcements and siege engineers. They mean to crush us in one decisive campaign." Boudica's eyes burned with determination. "Then we must prepare, not just for battle, but for survival. Rome will strike where we are weakest. We must be stronger, smarter, and faster. Every village, every forest, every river can be our ally. And if they think they can divide us, they will find only fire and steel." The next weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Tribes coordinated like never before. Hunters became scouts, blacksmiths forged new weapons, and women and elders worked tirelessly to stock supplies and secure safe havens. Ambushes were planned, decoys set, and hidden paths through the forests were mapped with precision. Boudica moved among the people, her presence a living symbol of hope and defiance. Yet even as Britannia braced for the coming storm, Rome's machinery churned relentlessly. Legions crossed the channel, ships brimming with soldiers and siege equipment. Commanders studied maps, logistics officers calculated supply chains, and spies infiltrated villages, seeking to uncover Boudica's plans. The empire's response was methodical, relentless, and terrifying in scale. The tension reached a climax when scouts reported the approach of a massive Roman army, twice the size of the force that had been defeated. The tribes gathered on the high ridges overlooking the plains. Boudica's voice carried across the valley, calm yet fierce. "Today, we face the might of the empire. Today, we fight not just for survival, but for every home, every child, every memory of our ancestors. Remember what we are fighting for. Remember who we are, and let Rome feel the wrath of Britannia." As the sun rose, the valley became a stage for history. The ground trembled beneath the marching legions, banners snapping in the wind, the air thick with the scent of tension and iron. The tribes took their positions, every ambush prepared, every trap set. Every arrow loosed, and every spear thrown would be a message. Britannia would not bow. The first clashes of the counteroffensive were brutal. Roman formations advanced steadily, disciplined and well-supplied, but the tribes were everywhere, hidden in forests, striking from riverbanks, ambushing supply lines, and harrying cavalry flanks. Fires consumed bridges and roads, forcing Roman soldiers into narrow, vulnerable paths. The chaos favored the defenders, but the price was immense in the chaos. Boudica, Ira, and Caius led daring strikes against key positions. They moved like shadows, cutting down Roman officers, sabotaging siege equipment, and rallying troops when morale faltered. Every skirmish, every trap, every desperate maneuver told a story of courage against overwhelming odds. But Rome was patient. The legions adapted, learned, and pressed on. Slowly, the tide began to shift. The empire's disciplined formations, overwhelming numbers, and engineering might turned the valley into a deadly chessboard. The tribes were fierce, but exhaustion, supply shortages, and attrition began to weigh heavily. Boudica realized that a single decisive battle could determine the fate of Britannia. As night fell over the bloodied plains, both sides regrouped. Fires burned across the valley, illuminating the horrors of war. The outcome remained uncertain. One thing was clear. The stage was set for a monumental clash, one that would echo across history and define the legacy of Boudica's rebellion and Rome's relentless pursuit of dominance. The dawn of the decisive day broke with an eerie stillness. Mist hung low over the valley, curling around the trees and the scattered villages that had become the staging ground for the final confrontation. Boudica rode at the front of her warriors, her face painted with streaks of red and black, symbols of defiance and mourning for those already lost. Beside her, Ira and Caius checked their lines, eyes scanning the horizon for signs of Rome's advance. From the distant hills came the unmistakable thrum of thousands of boots on earth. The Roman legions appeared like an unstoppable tide, their disciplined formations stretching as far as the eye could see. Standards waved in the wind, shields gleamed under the rising sun, and the clatter of armor created a mechanical symphony of inevitability. Boudica raised her hand. "Hold! Let them come. Let them see what Britannia is made of. We fight not for glory, but for every home, every family, every heartbeat of this land." As the Romans approached, the tribes unleashed the first wave of ambushes. Hidden skirmishers poured arrows into the advancing soldiers, while hidden pits and barricades tore through cavalry and foot soldiers alike. Fires engulfed supply wagons, forcing Roman engineers into dangerous rescue attempts. Chaos rippled through the Roman lines, but the legions adapted with mechanical precision, forming tighter units and pushing forward with relentless discipline. Boudica moved through the chaos like a force of nature, rallying her warriors, redirecting reinforcements, and striking fear into any who underestimated the tribes. Ira and Caius led flanking attacks, cutting through weak points in the Roman lines, while women and elders brought water and healing herbs to the wounded, ensuring that no one fell without care. Every village, every hill, every river became a weapon in the hands of the defenders. Hours passed in a blur of smoke, steel, and screams. Spears clashed with swords, arrows darkened the sky, and the earth itself seemed to shake under the combined weight of thousands of combatants. Yet even in the midst of fury, small moments of heroism shone through. A young warrior shielding a child from falling debris, a soldier turning to save a comrade instead of fleeing, Boudica herself striking down a centurion who had breached the line. But Rome's persistence began to tell. Legions regrouped, reinforcements arrived, and the tide slowly shifted. Boudica realized that traditional skirmishes and ambushes might no longer suffice. She needed a bold, decisive move, a strike that would either break Rome or cost her everything. Gathering her lieutenants, she whispered a plan. "We lure them into the forest beyond the river. The ground narrows, their numbers lose advantage, and we hit them from three sides. Every path they take, we control. This is our moment. The heart of Britannia will not fall quietly." As the tribes retreated into the forest, the Romans pursued, unaware of the deadly traps awaiting them. Hidden branches, pitfalls, and camouflage stakes slowed their advance. From the shadows, warriors leaped into battle, attacking in waves, then vanishing as quickly as they came. The Romans were disciplined, but the forest became a cage, and every mistake was punished with fire, steel, and relentless determination. In the center of the ambush, Boudica faced the Roman general leading the vanguard. Their eyes met across the chaos, the clash of two forces, one born of empire, one of defiance. Spears flew, swords clanged, and the forest echoed with the ferocity of human struggle. Boudica fought not just for victory, but for survival, her movements precise, deadly, and inspired by the spirits of her ancestors. By midday, the ambush had cost Rome heavily. Thousands were wounded or dead, their formations fractured and morale shaken. But the tribes too had paid dearly. Families lost, villages burned, and warriors fallen. The forest ran red with the sacrifices of both sides. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the survivors of Boudica's forces gathered on a ridge, bloodied, weary, but unbroken. Fires from the battle reflected in her eyes, a mix of grief and triumph. They had slowed Rome, inflicted unimaginable losses, and proven that Britannia would not bow easily. But the shadow of the empire still loomed, and the next encounter promised to be even deadlier. Boudica's voice rose over the ridge, carrying over the valley. We fight for our homes, for our children, for the memory of every soul who walked this land before us. Rome may strike again, but we are Britannia. We endure. We resist. From the distant hills, the Roman commanders regrouped, sending messengers back for reinforcements and preparing for a counterattack. The stage was set for the next phase of this brutal struggle, one that would demand courage, cunning, and the unbreakable spirit of a people unwilling to be conquered. The night after the forest ambush was eerily silent. Smoke from burned villages curled into the moonlight, carrying the scent of ash and blood. Boudica's warriors huddled around small fires, tending to the wounded, sharpening weapons, and whispering stories of ancestors who had fought the invaders centuries before. Every shadow seemed alive with danger. Roman scouts could appear at any moment, seeking vengeance for the losses they had suffered. Boudica herself rode along the ridge, surveying her weary but determined forces. Her armor was dented, her face smeared with dirt and blood, yet her eyes burned with a fire that no defeat could extinguish. Tonight, we rest. Tomorrow, we fight again, but we fight smart. We cannot match Rome in sheer numbers. We must use every river, every hill, every forest path to our advantage. The Romans, meanwhile, were far from defeated. Word of the ambush had reached the governor, who immediately summoned legions from neighboring provinces. Reinforcements arrived under the cover of dawn, their banners snapping in the cold wind, and their generals, trained in centuries of discipline, planned a decisive counterattack. This was no longer a skirmish. It was a war that could decide the fate of an entire land. Why the second day, the Roman legions had formed into massive cohorts, each unit drilled to perfection. Engineers built makeshift bridges, cleared paths through forests, and constructed siege engines designed to crush any resistance. Their strategy was clear: flush Boudica's forces from their hiding places, destroy the tribal infrastructure, and force a surrender through overwhelming force. Boudica called a council of her war leaders. Rome believes we are fractured. They think fear will break us. But our strength lies in our unity. We must strike where they least expect it, divide their forces, and harass them relentlessly. Every Roman killed, every supply line disrupted, every village they cannot take is a victory. For days, the land became a chessboard of ambushes, feints, and counterfeints. Tribes would vanish into the mist before the Romans could catch them. Fires would flare in the night, drawing the enemy into traps laid along hidden gullies and river crossings. Boudica's leadership inspired unparalleled courage. Even the elderly and young took up arms when necessary, understanding that the survival of their culture depended on every hand raised against the invader. Then came the day of the final engagement. The Romans, frustrated and enraged, concentrated their forces along a narrow valley near a major river. Here, Boudica realized the decisive moment would come. She marshaled her forces into a complex formation, stretching from the riverbanks to the forest edge, positioning archers on the cliffs and hidden cavalry in concealed hollows. Every element had a role. Every warrior knew the plan. When the Romans advanced, they were met not with a single line, but with waves of resistance. Spears rained down from the cliffs, arrows darkened the sky, and hidden warbands surged from the woods, striking and disappearing before the Romans could regroup. Fires blocked paths, rivers became treacherous, and the disciplined legions found themselves fighting a foe they could not easily contain. Boudica herself became the fulcrum of the battle, charging into the fray, her voice ringing out above the chaos. For Britannia, for our people, strike now, and let them remember our land. Her war cry was answered by thousands, a chorus of rage and defiance that seemed to shake the valley itself. But Rome, relentless and methodical, adapted quickly. They pushed forward in smaller, coordinated units, cutting through the ambushes, capturing key positions, and gradually encircling the tribal forces. Despite the brilliance of Boudica's tactics, the weight of the empire was too great to fully repel. By dusk, the valley lay littered with the dead and dying, both Roman and tribal. Boudica's forces, though heroic, were depleted, exhausted, and outnumbered. She knew that the coming night would decide whether Britannia would remain free or fall under the iron heel of Rome. Her mind raced, weighing every option, every hidden path, every possibility of turning the tide once more. But the empire's shadow loomed larger than ever as the last light of day faded. A messenger arrived with news from neighboring tribes. Some had rallied, others had fallen, and new Roman reinforcements were on the march. Boudica realized that this was no longer just a battle. It was the prelude to a war that would echo through history. Every decision from this point on would carry the weight of a people's legacy. And so, under the blood-red glow of sunset, Britannia braced itself for the next chapter of its struggle, a chapter that would test courage, loyalty, and the very spirit of freedom. The story of Boudica was far from over, but the winds of destiny were shifting, preparing the stage for either a legendary triumph or a tragic downfall. The final morning came not with chaos, but with silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that settled over the valley like a warning from the gods themselves. The mist clung low to the wrapping the hills and trees in a pale shroud, as if Britannia itself was holding its breath. Caius stood at the edge of the camp, gripping his blade tighter than ever before. Around him, the warriors of the tribes prepared in quiet determination. There were no loud speeches now, no roaring chants, only the soft sounds of armor being tightened, weapons being lifted, and last words whispered between families who knew this day might be their last together. Ira knelt beside Bridget and Turon, her hands resting gently on their shoulders. "Stay close. No matter what happens, stay together," she said, her voice calm, but her eyes betraying the storm within. Turon nodded, trying to be brave, while Bridget clutched a small charm, an old symbol of protection, passed down through generations. In the distance, the Romans assembled. This time, there was no hesitation, no confusion. The legions stood in perfect formation, shields locked, ranks deep, their discipline unshaken. At their head, the Roman commander had chosen the battlefield carefully, a narrow defile, flanked by woods, with no easy escape. It was a place where numbers and order would triumph over chaos and courage. Boudica rode before her army one last time. Her voice, though quieter than before, carried a weight that silenced every whisper. "They may have their formations, their armor, their empire," she said, her gaze sweeping across the warriors. "But we have something they will never understand. We fight for our lives, for our land, for our children. If we fall today, we fall as free people, not as slaves." A murmur spread through the ranks, not loud, not wild, but steady. A shared understanding, a final acceptance. Then the horns sounded. The Romans advanced like a wall of iron. Step by step, shield by shield, they closed the distance with terrifying precision. The tribes surged forward to meet them, a wave of raw courage crashing against disciplined steel. The first impact was deafening. Spears struck shields. Swords clashed. The air filled with dust, cries, and the brutal rhythm of battle. For a moment, the tribes held, fighting with everything they had, pushing back against the relentless advance. Caius fought like a man possessed, striking, blocking, moving through the chaos with desperate determination. Beside him, Ira loosed arrow after arrow, each one finding its mark, each one buying another heartbeat of survival. But the Roman formation did not break. They adapted, step by step. They pushed forward, their shields absorbing blows, their lines rotating with mechanical precision. Where one soldier fell, another stepped in. Their discipline turned the battlefield into a machine, grinding, unstoppable. The tribes, for all their bravery, began to falter. The narrow ground worked against them. Their numbers, once an advantage, became a trap. There was no room to maneuver, no space to retreat and strike again. Panic began to ripple through the rear ranks as the realization spread. This was not a battle they could outfight. Boudica saw it. From her position, she watched the line bend, then crack. Still, she did not retreat. She charged into the thick of the fight, her presence igniting one last surge of resistance. Warriors rallied around her, pushing forward with desperate fury, striking against the Roman wall with everything they had left. For a brief, fleeting moment, it seemed like the tide might turn, like sheer will could break the empire. But Rome did not break. The counter came swift and brutal. Roman troops surged forward in a coordinated push, driving wedges into the tribal lines, splitting them apart. Cavalry swept around the flanks, cutting off escape. The valley became a trap, and the tribes were caught within it. The battle turned into slaughter. Caius, bloodied and exhausted, found himself separated from Ira and the children. He fought his way through the chaos, calling their names, but the roar of battle swallowed his voice. Around him, warriors fell one by one, their courage unable to overcome the crushing force of the legions. Ira, clutching Bridget and Turon, tried to pull them toward the trees, but the path was blocked. Roman soldiers closed in, their shields forming an impenetrable barrier. Time seemed to slow. The sounds of battle faded into a distant echo as the reality settled in. This was the end, not just of the battle, but of the rebellion. High on a ridge, Boudica watched as her army collapsed. Smoke, fire, and steel consumed everything she had fought for. The dream of a free Britannia was slipping away, crushed beneath the weight of Rome. But even in that moment, she did not bow. Her story, her defiance, would not end in chains as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the valley of the fallen. The battle came to its inevitable conclusion. The tribes were broken, their forces scattered, their resistance crushed. For now, Rome had won the field. But the cost was written in blood, in memory, in the hearts of those who survived. And as night fell over Britannia, the land itself seemed to whisper the truth that no empire could erase. They had fought, they had resisted, and they would be remembered. The night after the battle was not filled with victory cries, but with silence, that a heavy, suffocating silence broken only by the crackle of dying fires and the faint groans of the wounded scattered across the valley. The ground, once alive with movement and fury, was now still, covered in the fallen, both Briton and Roman alike. Smoke drifted slowly into the dark sky, carrying with it the remnants of a dream that had burned bright and been crushed. Caius woke among the bodies. For a moment, he didn't move. His ears rang, his body ached, and his mind struggled to piece together what had happened. Then it came back, not as a clear memory, but as fragments. The clash, the screams, the push of the Roman line. The moment everything broke. Ira, his voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. He forced himself to stand, every muscle screaming in protest. Around him, survivors staggered through the darkness, calling names, searching desperately for loved ones. Some found them. Many did not. Caius moved through the wreckage, step by step, heart pounding harder with every passing moment. Then he heard a faint voice. "Father!" He turned sharply. There, near the edge of the broken tree line, he saw them. Ura, bloodied but standing, holding Bridget close while Turon leaned against her, exhausted but alive. Caius rushed forward, collapsing into them, holding them as if the world itself might tear them apart again. For a long moment, none of them spoke. Words were too small for what they had survived. They were alive. And that was everything. By dawn, the Romans had taken full control of the battlefield. Their discipline returned as quickly as it had vanished in the chaos. Survivors were rounded up. Weapons were confiscated. Camps were established with cold efficiency. To Rome, this was not the end of the story. It was the restoration of order. But for the people of Britannia, it was something else entirely. It was loss. Villages burned. Families shattered. Leaders gone. And yet, not broken. Because even in defeat, something remained. Memory. Boudica was gone. Some said she had taken her own life rather than be captured. Others whispered that she vanished into the hills, becoming something more than human, a spirit of the land itself. Watching, waiting, and no one knew for certain. But everyone remembered, and that was enough to end the days that followed. Caius and his family returned to what was left of their home near Verulamium. The town had changed. Where once there had been noise, trade, laughter, now there was caution. Roman soldiers patrolled more heavily than ever. New laws were enforced. Punishments were swift and public. Rome was making a statement. Rebellion would not be tolerated again. Caius rebuilt his forge, but his hammer no longer rang the same way. Each strike carried weight, memory, grief, and something deeper. Not defeat, but understanding. Ira tended to the wounded, just as she had before. But now there were more of them, and their wounds ran deeper than flesh. She listened to their stories, their losses, their quiet anger. Taran no longer played like a child. He watched the Roman soldiers with sharp eyes, learning, observing. Not out of hatred, but out of awareness. He was growing up in a world shaped by empire. Brigid, still holding her small charm, began to ask questions. Will they always rule us? Ira looked at her, then toward the distant hills. No empire lasts forever, she said softly. But what matters is that we remember who we are, no matter who rules the land. And that was the truth of it. Rome had won the battle. They would build roads, cities, walls. They would bring order, law, and their way of life. Britannia would change, slowly, deeply, in ways that could not be undone. But beneath it all, the old ways would survive. That I end stories told by firelight. I end symbols carved into metal and stone. I end quiet prayers whispered in hidden groves. I end people like Caius, like Ira, like their children. Years would pass. New generations would grow up knowing both worlds, Roman and Britain. Some would serve in the legions. Others would remember the old gods. Many would live somewhere in between, carrying a blended identity that neither side fully understood. But the story of that rebellion, of that queen who stood against an empire, would never fade. That it would be told and retold, changing slightly with each generation, but never losing its heart. Because it was more than a story of war. It was a story of people, of courage, of loss, of identity, and of a land that, no matter how many times it was conquered, never truly forgot itself. Years passed, and the scars of war slowly faded from the land, but never from memory.